The courtroom was a battlefield of silence, the kind that made the air feel heavy, like it was pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the mahogany benches and the polished floor. The judge, a stern-faced man in his late 50s, with a graying mustache and a robe that seemed to swallow his frame, sat high on his bench, flipping through a stack of papers with an air of disinterest. His name was Judge Harold Whitaker, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper disdain for what he called frivolous cases. At the defense table sat Elijah Carter, a 22-year-old black man with a lean frame and a face that betrayed his youth. His dark eyes were focused, his jaw set tight, but his hands resting on the table betrayed a slight tremble. He wore a suit that was a size too big, borrowed from his older brother, and a tie that felt like a noose around his neck. The suit was his armor, but it didn't feel like enough. Not here. Not in this room. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a crisp blazer and a voice that carried like a whip, was mid-sentence. Your Honor, the defendant's actions were not only reckless, but also a blatant disregard for the law. He knowingly objection. Elijah's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. It was the first time he'd spoken since the trial began, and the sound of it made the judge pause, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Well, well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The defendant has decided to grace us with his presence. Do enlighten us, Mr. Carter. What exactly are you objecting to? Elijah stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, the prosecutor's disdain, the jury's curiosity, the judge's amusement. But he also felt something else, a fire in his chest, a determination that had been building for weeks. Your Honor, Elijah began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The prosecution's characterization of my actions is not only inaccurate, but also prejudicial. I move to strike her last statement from the record. The judge chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that filled the room. You move to strike? He repeated, his smirk widening. Mr. Carter, do you even know what that means? Or are you just repeating something you heard on one of those lawyer shows? The courtroom erupted in laughter, a wave of sound that crashed over Elijah, threatening to drown him. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. But he didn't sit down. He didn't back down. Your Honor, Elijah said, his voice rising above the laughter. I may not have a law degree, but I know my rights. And I know that the prosecution's statement was improper. If you'd allow me to explain enough, the judge interrupted, his laughter fading as he waved a hand dismissively. Sit down, Mr. Carter. Let the adults handle this. Elijah didn't sit. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. He straightened his tie, his eyes locking with the judge's. Your Honor, with all due respect, I may be young, and I may be representing myself, but that doesn't mean I don't understand the law. And it doesn't mean I'm going to let this court railroad me. The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elijah. For the first time, there was no amusement in his gaze, only curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of respect. All right, Mr. Carter, the judge said slowly. You've got my attention. Let's hear it. Elijah Carter wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this courtroom, not fighting for his freedom. He was supposed to be in his final year at Howard University, studying political science and dreaming of a future where he could make a difference. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Elijah had caught one right in the gut. It started 6 months ago, on a cold November night. Elijah had been walking home from his part-time job at a community center when he heard the sound of breaking glass. He turned the corner to find a convenience store with its front window shattered, a shadowy figure darting out of the building and into the night. Without thinking, Elijah ran inside to check on the clerk, an elderly man named Mr. Patel, who always gave him free coffee and a smile. What he found was chaos. The store was trashed, and Mr. Patel was lying on the floor, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Elijah called 911 and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived. But when the police showed up, they didn't see a good Samaritan. They saw a young black man in a hoodie, standing in the middle of a crime scene. The next thing Elijah knew, he was in handcuffs, being read his rights. The police didn't believe his story. They didn't care that he had no prior record, that he was a straight-A student, that he had a future. All they saw was a suspect who fit the description, a young black man in a hoodie. The charges were serious, burglary and assault. If convicted, Elijah could face up to 10 years in prison. His family hired a lawyer, but the fees drained their savings, and the lawyer's efforts felt half-hearted at best. When it became clear that the lawyer was more interested in a plea deal than fighting for his innocence, Elijah made a decision. He would represent himself. It wasn't an easy choice. Elijah had no legal training, no experience in a courtroom. But he had something else, a sharp mind, a determination to prove his innocence, and a belief in the justice system, even if it didn't always believe in him. For weeks, Elijah buried himself in law books, studying case law, criminal procedure, and the rules of evidence. He spent hours at the library, poring over legal texts and watching courtroom videos online. He reached out to local legal aid organizations, asking for advice and guidance. It was grueling work, but Elijah didn't give up. He couldn't. His future depended on it. Now, standing in the courtroom, Elijah felt the weight of all those hours, all that effort. He knew the odds were against him. He knew the judge didn't take him seriously. But he also knew he had one thing on his side, the truth. The trial dragged on, each day a new battle. The prosecution presented their case with precision, painting Elijah as a reckless criminal who had acted out of desperation. They called witnesses a neighbor who claimed to have seen Elijah near the store that night, a police officer who testified about finding Elijah at the scene. They presented evidence, a grainy surveillance video that showed a figure in a hoodie, too blurry to make out a face. Elijah fought back as best he could. He cross-examined the witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in their stories. He challenged the evidence, arguing that the video was inconclusive and that the police had failed to investigate other leads. But it was an uphill battle, and he could feel the jury's skepticism growing with each passing day. The breaking point came during the prosecution's closing argument. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice dripping with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "the evidence is clear. The defendant was at the scene of the crime. He had the opportunity, the motive, and the means. This is not a case of mistaken identity. This is a case of a young man who thought he could get away with it. Don't let him." Elijah's heart pounded as he stood to deliver his closing argument. He knew this was his last chance to sway the jury, to make them see the truth. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors. They looked tired, impatient, ready to be done with this case. But Elijah wasn't ready to give up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "the prosecution wants you to believe that I'm guilty. They want you to see me as a criminal, as someone who doesn't deserve your sympathy or your understanding. But I'm not here to ask for your sympathy. I'm here to ask for your fairness." He paused, letting his words sink in. The prosecution's case is built on assumptions, not facts. They assume that because I was at the scene, I must be guilty. They assume that because I'm young, because I'm black, because I don't have a fancy lawyer, I must be lying. But assumptions aren't evidence, and they're not justice. Elijah walked over to the evidence table, picking up the surveillance video. "This video," he said, holding it up, "is the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But look at it closely. Can you see a face? Can you identify the person in this video? No, because it's too blurry, too unclear. And yet, the prosecution wants you to believe that this person is me. They want you to convict me based on a guess." He set the video down, his gaze returning to the jury. "I didn't break into that store. I didn't hurt Mr. Patel. I was trying to help him. And I'm not going to let the prosecution's assumptions take away my future. I'm not going to let them take away my freedom." Elijah's voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a student. I'm a son. I'm a brother. And I'm innocent. Please, don't let their assumptions become your verdict." The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Elijah sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his mind racing. He replayed every moment of the trial, every argument, every piece of evidence. Had he done enough? Had he convinced them? Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. "We, the jury," he began, his voice steady, "find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in noise gasps, murmurs, the sound of the prosecutor slamming her fist on the table. Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him, so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. He turned to the jury, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. But the judge wasn't done. "Mr. Carter," Judge Whitaker said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Before you go, I want to say something." Elijah turned to face the judge, his heart pounding. "What now?" Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I'll admit," he said slowly, "when you first stood up in my courtroom, I didn't take you seriously. I thought you were in over your head. But you proved me wrong. You showed a level of legal acumen and determination that I rarely see, even from seasoned attorneys." He paused, his gaze softening. "You've got a gift, Mr. Carter. Don't waste it." Elijah walked out of the courtroom a free man, but he knew his journey wasn't over. The trial had changed him, awakened something inside him. He had seen the flaws in the system, the biases, the injustices, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. As he stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, Elijah made a decision. He would go to law school. He would become a lawyer, not just to defend the innocent, but to fight for a system that was fair and just for everyone. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I've got some news." As he walked away from the courthouse, Elijah couldn't help but smile. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. He had faced the system and won, and he was just getting started.